recording up. Okay. Hi everyone, and yeah, all good.
Y'all good.
Okay. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Digital Nomad World weekly lecture. I'm Becca, and today I will be speaking with Becky from the School of Travel's podcast. So, hello, Becky.
Hello, Becca. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you. So first, I'm going to start by asking you where you're calling in from.
So I'm calling in from the 40th floor of the WeWork on Corrientes Avenue in Buenos Aires, Argentina. This is the top floor. I wanted to be in the best spot for you guys.
Awesome, that's great. So we're going to start today by asking you just to introduce what you do. So I'm going to start with asking you to tell us a little bit about the School of Travel's podcast. So if you can just tell me a little bit about when you got started with that and the mission of the podcast.
Sure. So I'll be very honest with everybody and upfront. So right now, the School of Travel's podcast is still a passion project for me. It's not making my full-time income. I am a proofreader of academic journals. I say by day, and by late afternoon, I am a podcaster. And I started my digital nomad journey in 2017. And by 2018, so about 6 months later, I decided to start the podcast as a way to share what I had been learning with people from my travels, and also talk with fellow digital nomads to connect with them. I thought this is a great way to connect with people and also to network by having a podcast. And then what we share together in our interviews, people can learn from. And I really ask what travel has taught people. So I love interacting with people, and my different guests of mine have become friends with each other. They've gotten jobs from each other, and it's been a lot of fun, and it's still going on.
That's great. That sounds like it's a really nice kind of way of bringing together information and advice for nomads basically through your podcast. So let's go back to the beginning of your journey. So I guess when did you first become a digital nomad, or when did your journey begin in kind of making a transition from growing up in the US to kind of exploring the world?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Cincinnati, Ohio, and no one in my family speaks any other language. I was the first person to finish a 4-year degree at college, and but from a young age, I loved watching movies, and I was the first person in my family to also watch a foreign film. To quote my stepdad, I don't want to read a movie. So it was a very we like to go places in the US, but my family was not internationally minded at all. And so one of these movies I saw was Lost in Translation. And I would say that changed my life, because I saw it in college and I was due to graduate in 6 months. And I happened to go to my college career fair in Ohio, and they were offering people to go and teach English in Japan. And they said teach English for a year of adventure. And that was the first time they'd ever come to my college. And this movie Lost in Translation is set in Japan. And Tokyo just looked like such a cool place when I saw that movie. And the timing worked out. And the funny thing was, when I was at that career fair, the guy standing at the booth, he also said, "Okay, you went to Fairfield High School. Do you know a girl named Tiffany?" And her last name. And I said, "Yeah, but I haven't talked to her since high school." I Googled her name and the university where she was. A phone number popped up on Google, and this was 2004, so Google barely existed. And I called the number, and she answered the phone. And so that made me even more confident to go to Tokyo, because I knew someone I knew would be there, even if they didn't live nearby. And about 3 months after graduating, I interviewed, got the job, and 4 months after graduation from high school, I moved to Tokyo, Japan, and I started teaching English, and a year became 12. So
That's amazing.
I lived there. Yeah, I lived there for 12 years, not teaching the whole time. I actually left twice during that time thinking I was done with Japan, but Japan would just not let me go. If you've been, it's one of those places where it's so distinctive that you're either, well, I wouldn't say you're going to love it or you're going to hate it, but it can really grip you. And I ended up teaching English first. Then I actually worked for PricewaterhouseCoopers doing taxes for expats for 4 years. And then I left that. It was a very intense work life at that place. And I quit that. I went back home and then I'm like, you know what? I'm going for teaching full on now. I'm going to get my master's degree in education, which I did when I went back the third time. That whole time I was actually in Tokyo, I had the same work visa. I never like gave up the visa in between these times, but I was never away from Japan for more than a year so that it worked. I could keep that visa. And so eventually I got permanent residency in Japan, which I still have. And my final job there, I was teaching English to lawyers. I was kind of using that business side and the English teaching side. And that was really, really cool.
Oh, that's really awesome. So basically you kind of went from your studies to teaching English in Japan, and that kind of snowballed from there, and you ended up staying and making that kind of your focus. So I guess whilst you were, I guess during your first year teaching, did you see that as being like your future, or did you fall in love with that kind of working abroad, or did you kind of have the mindset that maybe this would just be a temporary thing?
To be honest, Becca, I never knew what I wanted to do in life. I don't know if anybody listening or who
I still
sees this
don't.
can relate. Yeah. I double majored because I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I started as an English literature major. When I was almost done with that, I started as a finance major, general finance. And then 3 years into that, I added English lit and just finished both of them. Because I'm like, well, it's great to be able to write and read and all those things, but also the finance thing was just like, okay, that's a very practical degree. Maybe I can do something with both. And I ended up doing something with both, which is cool. But I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I thought at first I'll do this for a year and then I'll go back into the US and do something with finance. But I just love that life abroad, and being an expat is different from being a digital nomad. I'm happy to say that I know how to do both and what both lifestyles are like, because they are quite different. But yeah, Tokyo, it's so fun, guys. If you haven't been there, you got to go. Japan itself, it's an amazing country.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. It's a very unique place and always full of surprises. So you're also a resident in Portugal. So
Now, yes.
I guess how did you end up being there? What happened after Tokyo and after teaching?
So as everybody knows that thinks about Japan, they have a crazy work ethic and they don't have a work-life balance there. And I think after 12 years, especially after I had the permanent residency, which it takes 10 years on a work visa to get if you're just doing like a regular job and you're not like, you don't come in with really special skills. I thought, okay, I have the residency. I know I can come back at any point and do any job with this visa that I have, but I want to try something else. Like, I'm tired of coming into a cubicle or with the teaching the lawyers, like into a law firm and waiting, and my work was on somebody else's time. And I got tired of like running between different skyscrapers, like waiting for these people that, they're lawyers. It's a very serious profession. And so I wanted to feel more relaxed in general. And so I said, okay, it's time I actually got the freelance proofreading job before I left the teaching the lawyers job. So I was doing both simultaneously for a little while. And for me, it was perfect because if the lawyer, I taught one-on-one, if the lawyer didn't come into the client room, I could just open up my laptop and start doing my proofreading. It was really cool, and a good balance to do both. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to just still be having to go to a space to work and looking a certain way. And, it was still not freedom to me. So eventually I worked it all out. I had to have 4 different dinners with 4 different bosses when I quit my job in Tokyo, saying like, I'm really leaving. Like, I really want to go. And I kept that proofreading job and just said, okay, I know I already have income. I'm going to go first to New Zealand. And I want to go there for 5 weeks because I've never been there. And it's very easy to get there from Japan because it's about a similar time zone. There's a direct
Yeah.
flight. And that's where it started in November of 2017. And I just, adjusted to that life. But actually, I had it really easy because I already knew how to do my job completely. And my job, I get the work and I have 24 hours to get it back. So I can move that time around. If I want to do something in the morning and work at night, I can do that. And that was more the freedom I was looking for.
So would you say, would you class yourself as being an expat before 2017? And then that's kind of when you were, I guess, transitioned into being a digital nomad?
Yes. And then to answer your Portugal question. So I was a nomad until the world made me stop being a nomad, made us all stop being nomads. And I thought, I was very familiar with expat life. And so I kind of missed some aspects of expat life, to be honest, after 3.5 years on the road. I wanted to be able to have a better kitchen and go to a gym regularly and not be moving as much. Certain things I missed like that. So I thought, okay, maybe I can have it both ways. I can be half of my year in Lisbon if I could get residency there, and then half of the year on the road, which is now what I'm hoping to do. So I knew that it was easy for Americans, relatively speaking, to get a visa to Portugal. There were two different ways, like either this D7 visa, which is for freelancers or retirees, or this golden visa. And I quickly learned that the golden visa was not going to be good for me financially. I didn't have the money because they want money from outside of Portugal. They want you to just throw, it's like a minimum of 280,000 euros outside that you just better have on hand to get this golden visa. And so I thought, let me just try to apply. So I made this really Hail Mary flight from Tokyo to Lisbon in 2020. There were 2 flights going out of the airport in Tokyo at that time. And you can imagine that's very, very abnormal for any airport in Tokyo. That's how locked down this place was. But I convinced them to let me leave because I was leaving, not coming in. So I made the flight, and then I convinced the immigration authorities in 2020 to let me get into Portugal. I think partly because I was coming from Japan, which at the time was on the green list. And I got in, and then I quickly learned you can't apply for residency in Portugal for Portugal. You need to do it from your home country. And I was like, man, I just got here. I don't want to go to the US. There's a lot of cases over there, but I did. I actually flew back to the US. I applied. It took a week to apply. And then this is the crazy part. I had a second US passport by chance that still had 6 months left on it. In the US, if you're American, you can legally get a second US passport, and it's only good for 4 years. I had applied when I went to Israel in 2017, and I just happened to still have it. And I was able to use that passport to actually go to Mexico and wait for the passport to come back, or not the passport, but the approval for the visa.
Yeah.
And then my mom got it at her address, and I flew back in and then picked up that passport and used it to fly back into Portugal. And the reason I say that is, as a person that used to do US taxes, I couldn't be in the US for more than 35 days, or I would accrue more taxation. So I knew that. So I was like, I have to limit those US days. I can't wait in the US if I can avoid that. So that's why I did that. But that was a really crazy way to get in, but I got approval and I flew back in at the end of 2020.
So I guess on the timeline of living in Japan to turning into a digital nomad, or trying the digital nomad lifestyle for a bit, to then getting your residency in Portugal, when did you start the podcast, the School of Travel's podcast?
So that was in 2018, when I was definitely a nomad. I was actually in Bansko, Bulgaria, where we met, Becca. And I was in a weekly mastermind course that they were having. And I just got inspired. I'm like, I really want a way to connect with people. And I want to hear their stories. I love hearing people's stories. But if you just meet up at a cafe or even like a workshop that nomads often do, it's not the same depth of a conversation usually. Or it just happens in a very haphazard way. With a podcast, it's like you have the questions and you can really dig deep, and people are, they know why you're asking them, and they are comfortable to tell you their story. So it really worked for me. And the other thing was, which I haven't mentioned, I've often been told you have one of those radio voices. You know, you have this, it's easy to understand. My students would tell me that in Japan, and I'm like, hey, maybe it's going to work out if I do something audio related. So that was another reason I tried it.
So you, I guess, just to begin with, you were still working with your editing, as your sort of source of income, and then you started the podcast, like you said earlier, as a passion project just for fun.
Mm-hmm.
I guess at that point, so you've been doing it for 4 years now. At that point, what was your mission for setting it up? Was to talk with other nomads and kind of share stories and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that interest in like educating people for travel came from some of your previous work, or did you feel there was a gap in your own like resources for trying to find information? Like, was there a reason for wanting to call it the School of Travels and focus on kind of educating people?
So I had really been inspired by two podcasts in particular when I was still in that cubicle, and I just was so grateful to those people that had decided to share stories, because it worked. It inspired me to get out of the cubicle, and I wanted to help other people. And one of those podcasts was called Living Unconventionally with Brittany Felix, and she actually stopped her podcast while I was still in Japan, and I was like, oh, I love that podcast, and I thought maybe I can, like, in her honor, like kind of continue this idea. And I like that she was a woman, and she was, the thing was, she wasn't actually a digital nomad yet. She was interviewing people to like learn about it and try to start doing it on her, you know, with her husband. But it turned out they decided to stay in the States. And I was inspired by that. And the other one, if anyone's wondering, is Travel Like a Boss by Johnny FD. But Johnny FD is a very different like persona than I am. So I just thought there's different podcasts, there's different, you know, ways to reach out to the community. And I thought, let me try my way. We're all different as well. If you're thinking about starting a podcast, you know, you're always going to do something different than what other people are doing. So why not give it a try? You never know.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess you always have your opportunity as well to share your own stories and experiences too. So it's always going to be different. There's always going to be
Yeah.
different content to share. So I guess how do you choose or find the people you want to speak to? Do you kind of look at areas where there may be sort of information and advice lacking on the internet, or do you kind of ask people for interesting stories?
Yeah, it's kind of a combination. So it started with asking people I already knew through my travels that I thought had wonderful stories, and I wanted to share them. So I actually went to Japan shortly after Bonsko in 2018. And that's where I really was doing the startup work of like interviewing a bunch of people at a co-working space, a lot of them based in Japan, and like trying to get those first interviews going. And it kind of made sense because Japan is where I had the most experience in general. So I reached out to my community there. And there's also not a lot of Japanese nomads. And actually, the people I interviewed were not nomads in those first few interviews. But the point of my podcast as well is like, what have you learned from travel? So even people that were not nomads I do interview. Right now, I'm kind of doing a theme of like co-working spaces. I interviewed a guy who runs a really great one in Lisbon. And then I interviewed someone who just became a digital nomad since the pandemic. And I'm just about to put out an interview with someone who is a remote jobs coach. So it's this whole shift that we've all gone through with the pandemic. A lot of people who've never had the chance to be a digital nomad, they might be able to now. So it's like I kind of wanted to put out a theme to help people, because also doing a podcast like this about travel when we haven't been able to travel, it's like, what do you do? And I think it's
Yeah.
right now following the trends of what is happening and what may happen soon that will encourage people to start traveling or living the life they want to live. Because I think this is also a lot about freedom that travel
Yeah.
brings you. So
Yeah, I saw on your website that you talk about kind of the importance of travel for educating and for changing and kind of developing as a human. I guess what are your own personal experiences from that? Like, do you think I mean, I'm sure you've changed a lot, living in Japan and then going to Portugal. But I guess what do you think is that? Why do you think this? What's the importance of this impact on people? What do you think? Like, how do you think it can change them in a good way?
Yeah, so okay, just full disclosure, I grew up in a very religious family. And with that often comes a very sense of rootedness. Like my mother still goes to the same church she went to when she was born with her parents. And I love that sense of rootedness. I don't have such a sense. It's nice to be able to come back to that. But if I just thought if I had chosen to follow exactly the way I was raised and I never looked outside or tried outside, how different my life would have been. You never know that what path, how things are going to differ. But I wanted to try. I think because we were so rooted in Cincinnati, I was like, what else is out there? There's got to be more out there. And one thing I learned is like when I went to Tokyo, and this is another reason I stayed so long, I didn't know what good food was. I was, raised by a single mother for like the early part of my life. She was not cooking. We were going to McDonald's. We were going to a lot of those American fast food restaurants you've heard of. And I thought that's what food was. And then I got to Tokyo and I'm like, food can be this good? There can be this much variety? What? Because I mean, in Cincinnati, when I left for Japan, we still didn't have like Indian restaurants. We didn't have Thai restaurants. It was mostly fast food restaurants. So my idea of what food could be just grew so much. And now I'm one of those people that I would call a foodie. Japan made me a foodie. And I'm one of those people, I'll try anything. I'm not a vegan or a vegetarian yet, but I literally will try food. And that curiosity was definitely sparked by traveling.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with you on that. I think we can learn a lot through food. I feel like food is something every culture kind of shares. It's a good way to have an exchange and kind of learn about other places and traditions and how they live.
And I actually have to share a story that like my mother helped pay for half of my college. And when I grew up and like started making some money, I always wanted to pay her back in some way, at least some part of it. Luckily I didn't go to an expensive college and college wasn't crazy expensive at the time. But what I decided to do in the end is she chose to go to the Holy Land with me. She, being such a religious person, I'm paying for it, mom, whatever you want, we're going to do a tour. She chose her tour. And when we were there, I got to see her interacting with Israeli people. And I saw this light go off in her mind of like, oh, they're not bad people. Just because they're not Christian, they're Jewish, it doesn't mean that they're like bad people I should avoid. And it was just like, that's something that is such a lesson. Like when you're in one place, to see that embrace and that like, calming down of like your own, like, rigid beliefs. It's really powerful.
Yeah, it's almost a little bit like kind of overcoming the fear of the unknown. I think a lot of people, if you stay in one place, you can sometimes end up developing more kind of fears, and perhaps that stops you from exploring more. So I guess is that part of the mission of your podcast, to try and help get people out there and get them to experience new things?
Yeah. So even like, okay, for example, right now, my boyfriend is somebody I met on the Nomad cruise. If you haven't heard of that, or for people who haven't heard of it, right now the Nomad cruise doesn't exist for obvious reasons, but it may come back in the future. But my boyfriend is quite into cryptocurrency, and I was into it separately, like not as early back as he was, but now that's another thing. I interviewed him on the podcast. It's like introducing these things that people do use as tools when they're traveling, to either help their passive income, or like, some countries now are accepting Bitcoin as it's their legal tender. So
Yeah.
I'm always introducing these ideas when I can, when I encounter them, and I try to have people on. So
Yeah, that's fantastic. So I guess because we have such a mixed community, we have well-established digital nomads, we have aspiring digital nomads, and all kinds of travelers, people from all different backgrounds and parts of the world. Um, I guess how would you? So you're a freelancer, and you're set up as a freelancer in Japan when you were doing your teaching, or were you employed?
So I was employed and I had like side income as a freelancer. at that point.
So as the freelance, was that registered in Japan, or where is your business registered, and how did you find setting that up and kind of working in different countries to perhaps the one your business is registered in?
So I had my business registered, and it still is registered in the US. But I was reporting it. So because of the tax background I was reporting everything in Japan, but then it was all kind of exempt on the US side because Japan had a higher tax rate. So it covered everything. It's kind of complicated, but yes, I was, had the business in the US, but the employee part of me was fully in Japan. So I was just reporting both.
Okay, so I guess what would you say have been the most difficult, or like the biggest challenges you've faced with having, I guess, remote work or freelance work?
So
Or just one of the biggest challenges you've had, I guess.
Oh yeah. So as a podcaster, one of my biggest challenges is actually finding a quiet enough space to do an interview.
Yeah.
You would think certain places are quiet, but then you get to the Airbnb and you're on a busier street than you thought, and there's construction going. Because the one thing you don't know is if there is construction going on nearby. I hope Airbnb puts in that option at some point. But so that's a thing as a podcaster. I recorded in closets and cars, like late at night, whenever it could be the quietest. And also, I think any nomad would tell you Wi-Fi. If you go to very remote locations, if that's one of your travel things, it's like, good luck. Sometimes you have to, I actually have gone into the lobbies of 5-star hotels or pretended or asked them, hey, can I use your Wi-Fi for a few minutes? I really need to send this. So it's probably the two biggest things.
Yeah. We have a question in from the audience. What are some of the most important lessons you've learned from the people you've interviewed on your podcast?
So I would say just the idea of, getting out of your comfort zone, and being okay with that, feeling the fear and doing it anyway, kind of thing. So one of the early people I interviewed, he's one of my travel idols. He's been to over 100, almost 120 countries now. And he would put himself in these I thought they were dangerous places, but he would always come back with these incredible stories of these people that just took him into his home essentially. And he learned so much. And he also liked to read about every place he would go, both fiction and nonfiction, by preferably writers from those countries. And so he was really educating himself about countries. And I've tried to do that when I can, going to new places. And so these kind of valuable little lessons that you never expect you're going to learn when you interview somebody. And then you're like, oh, that's a good practice.
Yeah. And that's a good one, to kind of always be pushing yourself outside of boundaries and kind of trying new things, which I think is important. We have another question. How much time, this one's more related to the podcast itself, how much time and emphasis do you put on editing and post-production? Is it more of a challenge being a digital nomad?
Yes. So I have to say, this came very naturally, organically, I should say, when it happened. But I edited so I have now 66 episodes that are out, and I edited them myself for probably up to episode 53 or 54. So just this year, or so 2021, I was approached by someone I had interviewed on the podcast, and this is how it all comes together. He said, I now have gone into podcast editing, and I'm going to give you a friend's rate. Would you like me to edit your podcast? And I'd always been hesitant about spending the money to do it, but I'm like, you know what? He's going to do such a great job. And it really freed up my time, because I was spending for an hour interview, it was probably 3 hours of my time to edit it myself. And I knew I wasn't the best editor either. And apologies if you listen to some early episodes, you're like, I know what you're saying, Becky. But he had really put the work into the expertise, and that's where he was going with his own business. So now I have 2 episodes that come out a month usually, and I pay him for those episodes.
Oh, that's fantastic. So how many do you try and record 2 a month, or do you often have like a stock of recordings and then just release the 2 a month as you go?
I would recommend having a stock. It depends. Sometimes if I'm in a really like if an area full of nomads, full of stories, or I'm meeting people that are inspiring me and I want to interview them, I'll stock it up. But sometimes I'm still looking for someone to interview and it's like a few days before I need to send it. It happens. But the funny thing is I often get people coming to me who want to be interviewed, or just when I least expect it, one of my friends contacts me and he says, I have this person for you, or I want to be interviewed. And then I always like to see an angle with my episodes, like what is a lesson I can teach the audience when I'm going to put this episode out. As I mentioned, like the cryptocurrency related episode. Yeah. One person has contacted me recently. He wants to talk about buying real estate in different countries and what he offers. So yeah, I'm like, oh, I don't have that topic up yet. Let's do that in the future.
I guess since you've started your podcast and kind of making the transition to kind of go from being more of an expat to a remote worker, what would you say have been your biggest rewards?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So I would say just the flexibility to jump in to things that you're really passionate about. I'm like, I used to do the thing as an expat where I would, the longest I would go away would be 2 weeks, but then I had to come back and it was very rigid and there was a lot of stress with getting back on time. And so it's just so great to like, I still set an alarm usually. Some days I don't, but it's nice to have that flexibility of like, that pressure is gone to like always have things at a certain time and like, you know, have to say no a lot to like workshops or like week-long programs you want to join. Now I feel like I can do it. Now it's more like, which one should you do? Sometimes there's, you suffer from like too much choice as a digital nomad. Where do I go next? Oh, this person's asking me about this person, you know, that can be a challenge too sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess there are always pros and cons with choosing that kind of lifestyle. So I'm going to ask you one last question before we finish the interview. What is one piece of advice that you would give to aspiring digital nomads, or those who are kind of looking to transition into a remote work lifestyle?
So when I ask this question to people, they always say, just start. So I'm not going to say something like that. Yeah. I'm going to say, like, think about what you enjoy in your social life and how you're going to take that into being a digital nomad. Because I think that's the other thing, like one of the number one things people struggle with is, am I going to be lonely in this lifestyle? How am I going to meet people? And luckily we have this really nice website now, the Digital Nomad World. It's going to be a great tool, I think, going forward. But like, get into Facebook groups, start thinking about hobbies that you're going to enjoy on the road. Like if you're a runner, start looking at running groups in a place you want to go. Or if you're like into cryptocurrency, is there a cryptocurrency meetup? Like look at the meetups, because that's another way to meet people, or co-working spaces. But and don't be afraid to like, I've met people by being asked a random question in a co-working space, like something about what I'm wearing, or, oh, do you have a pencil like on hand? You know, and then once the conversation can start, then you can, you know, deepen that connection. So don't be afraid to even ask questions like that to people in a new place and start to form a friendship.
Yeah, that's a fantastic piece of advice. So thank you. Thank you very much for joining us today. If anyone wants to listen to your podcast or find out more about what you do, where is best for them to head?
So they could go to Spotify and just put in The School of Travels with an S, or we're also on Apple Podcasts. I have at The School of Travels on Instagram as well. And yes, and I would say like one thing that I have a lot of knowledge on is Japan. So there are a few episodes in the 66 that I go into like traveling around Japan and places you can go. And I think there's some really great information in those episodes. So if you're into Japan, check those out.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. If anyone has any more questions, you can either head over to the community and find Becky on there and ask in the weekly lectures, or find her at her Instagram for the School of Travels.
Also, I'm at Tokyo Becky as well on Instagram. That was my old name that I kept. So if you want to reach out to me on Instagram, at Tokyo Becky is another place you can go.
Perfect. Thank you. So thank you very much for joining us today. For those of you
Thank
who
you,
will be
Becca.
joining, yeah, thank you. Next week, we will be speaking with Sophia Carcava, who is a leadership coach and human resources advisor. So if you want to join us again next week, we'll see you at 5 p.m. So thank you. And thanks again, Becky.
You're welcome. Thank you guys for joining.
Yeah, thank you.